That was so bad.
No, not that. Electronic. That was kind of scary.
But now I was ready for it. I have to go up with that. Just go back and forth. If it does.
The speaker appears is an electronic crackling that I unfortunately know all too well.
Just name it up. Just name my book out so I can write down some.
So you guys ready to get going? I'll pass around a sign-in sheet for you guys. Just jot down your name, first and last. Whenever it comes around, just make sure it gets back to me by end of class. All right, so did everyone get the emails about the extra credit assignments? Yeah, so you're eligible to do both of them if you think you need to, that's fine. Any questions, comments, concerns about anything? All good. You can just jump into the Cold War era, post-war era, however you want to refer to it. So you'll see the sort of headline of this one, or is Affluent but Anxious Society. So we'll look at sort of like the economic boom, but also a bit of trepidation when it comes to this era in American history. So I'm sure everyone in the class who's been conscious in the past few years has heard this term, Make America Great Again. So what era in history do you think is usually being referred to when people say Make America Great Again? Go ahead, Adam.
This era like post-war when the economic boom, kind of like commercialism and the beginnings of the nuclear family and 2.36.
Yeah, good. So I mean, usually like Donald Trump's childhood, I think is what's being referred to. Or a lot of Trump supporters' childhood, the 1950s, the baby boomers, as they call it. It's just boomers. That's what short it too. So yeah, as Isla was alluding to, there's a really low unemployment rate for the 50s. It's between 4% and 6%. A historically high GDP. In 1950 alone, the economy grew 8.7%, or at least the GDP did. There's high rates of ownership, home ownership. Of course, homes are considered the cornerstone of American consumerism, of American identity, of American affluence. The federal government, the Federal Housing Administration, guarantees loans to qualified buyers. But as we'll see next week, that's a bit problematic because it's something called redlining, where African Americans, people of color, a lot of working class people are largely locked out of sort of the fruits of home ownership. And of course, the GI Bill, people who fought in World War II, come home from the war, they're almost guaranteed to get free education, free housing, or not free housing, but at least a guaranteed loan. And of course, the US emerges from World War II as the preeminent world economic and military power. And as Isla was alluding to, this notion of family values is sort of central to American popular culture, the notion of a husband as the breadwinner, the wife at home, tending to chores and cooking, looking after the kids going to good, usually suburban schools, things like that. So that's the popular culture image, but as we'll see, it's a bit more complex than that. All right, so we looked at this ad a few times in the first part of the semester. So who wants to give me what the social tableau for this ad is? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say it's looking past the war into the future because it says there's a forward in your future. So it's like it's a literal kind of meaning.
Yeah, exactly. So the whole ethos during the war is we all sacrifice, we all come together so that after the war we can get back to a 1920s era level of consumerism. So what do you make of this sort of like imagery here? Yeah, go ahead.
You can kind of go anywhere with the board.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. We'll get to that in just a bit. Did you guys want to add anything?
Oh, I thought because it's like post-war, it's like a back of like the different places where like the war happened or took place.
Yeah, I mean, the war doesn't really happen in the US. One of the things that allows the US to emerge as the world's preeminent empire after World War II is that Europe and Asia are largely decimated, but the US homeland remains intact. But yeah, I mean, I think there's what they're pointing to here is the new highway system that's being built. And as you alluded to, we can sort of like go across the country. But also you have sort of like the dad and the daughter, this suburban like pastiche, this sort of like suburban ideal of what American life is, and at least in the realm of consumer culture. So yeah, I mean, the whole ethos of the Cold War, post-war era is that the future is now, which is alluding to what you said about, you know, everyone sacrificing during the war. And then now that the war is over, the future is now. What else might give people a notion that like the future is now and like the past and the future aren't nearly as important as they were? How did the war finally end? Go ahead.
The war ended with Germany like giving up and surrendering after like Hitler killed himself because he couldn't handle him being arrested and then getting his like ASS kicked. So he decided to kill himself, and then that's how Germany surrendered without its great leader. So then after they surrendered, they had huge victory, and then this would represent futures now is representing like how we're gonna live the rest of our lives, which isn't so perfect now.
That's part of it. I mean, Germany does surrender in 1944. The war doesn't actually end until 1945. And what ends it? Go ahead, Ida.
The A-bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right. So this is the era of like atomic sort of the A-bomb. So this notion that humanity could be destroyed with the push of a button any minute. So, you know, live for today. Tomorrow isn't promised to you. So there's that whole ethos that's driving consumer culture. So anybody know who this handsome devil is? Yeah, he's the first American in space. Enos, the monkey who flew to outer space in 1961. Thanks. Cheers. All right, so yeah, I mean, as I said when we were going through the progressive era, the main word that I want you to take away from the progressive era is that it's a paradox. When you're thinking of this era, you need to think like dynamic in good ways and bad. Of course, you have the baby boom. In the Western world in particular, the UK, US in particular, you can see the rates of population boom from 1946 to 1960. It's just really like off the charts in both the US and UK. And of course, this is creating new consumers. So part of the reason there's such a prominent baby boom during this era is that there's been a penicillin vaccine that was developed during World War II. Jonas Salk here develops the polio vaccine, so it's just easier to stay alive, not as nearly high as an infant mortality rate as there had been in previous generations, decades, what have you. So this guy, John Kenneth Galbraith, writes a best-selling book called The Affluent Society. And in it, he sort of argues that the US is more affluent than it's ever been for all of the reasons that we looked at and Ila pointed out. But he has sort of like not a altogether celebratory notion. You can see I put an asterisk by Affluent Society, because Galbraith argues that the US economy was largely based on hedonistic consumption of products, which would inevitably lead to economic inequality as the private sector enriched itself at the expense of the American public. And as we'll see, he was pretty much right about that. So what's driving all of this economic boom of the 1950s is the transformation of the US from a producerist nation, which begins to take place throughout the late 1800s into the 1900s, but it's like full on in the 1950s in particular. So we go from New Deal Keynesianism of the 1930s, that aggregate consumer deficit spending ethos, to post-war consumerism. And just to remind you, FDR in the New Deal, the government argued that the government was best suited to address the needs and wants of the polity and sought to connect political activism and democracy. Edward Bernays in the National Association of Manufacturers sought to undermine the New Deal in the post-war era, concomitant to portraying big business and consumerism as the cornerstone of American democracy. The NAM in particular championed the idea that passive consumers were essential in a big democracy such as the US, and that a passive and satiated consumer meant stability and growth. So there's this thing that comes about in the post-war period called the people's capitalism. And just some important points to take away are that the nation's two largest unions, the AFL and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, joined to form the AFL-CIO. But by 1960, union workers comprised a smaller overall percentage of workers than in the 1950s. And even though blue-collar unionized workers did not gain any real control of the workplace during the prosperity of the 50s, they did benefit materially through steady pay increases, significant expansion of job benefits such as medical insurance, paid vacations, and retirement benefits. Big corporations such as GE and GM provided these benefits in exchange for agreements like the Treaty of Detroit, in which the United Auto Workers agreed to take labor radicalism off the table if the company expanded the benefits of packages. So this gives you a sense that even the labor movement is becoming a consumerist movement that cares more about, enriching its own sort of self and the family, in this greater affiliation of belonging first and foremost to your family and not so much to the labor union or what profession you are, like, car manufacturer or whatever. There's new organizations that sprout up, the Junior Achievement League, which was like a high school club that you could join, advocated for free market capitalism. So you can imagine like kids after school just getting together and talking about the joys of laissez-faire capitalism, things like that. There's two economic professors who are predominantly responsible for this inversion or this move away from Keynesian economics. One is Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman, and these guys are sort of like the fathers, as it were, of this people's capitalism that becomes so pervasive in American society in the post-war period. But it's important to note that for many elderly minority and rural Americans, the so-called affluent society remained out of reach, while American corporations, through conservative groups like the American Enterprise Association, actively worked to undermine the social safety net of the New Deal, which hasn't really led up through the 20th century into the 21st. So during the 1950s, more money was spent on advertising than on public education, which I think is just an astonishing stat. Newly available credit cards, including the Diners Club, American Express, and Sears, made it easier for Americans to purchase and enjoy advertised products. So again, you might remember in the 1920s, car companies are giving out lines of credit so that people can buy cars. In the 1950s, credit cards become rather ubiquitous. And for the first time in American history, political leaders, economists, and foreign policy experts recognized that consumption and not production was the single most important contributor to America's economic health. And just to give you a sense of how important consumerism had become, home ownership, Khrushchev and Nixon in 1959 have a debate at the American National Exhibition, which is this big exhibition that was held in Moscow in which the US tried to show the Russians the best aspects of American society, and the Russians tried to show the Americans the best aspects of their society. And Khrushchev and Nixon have a debate in sort of like some kitchen that's set up to celebrate how great American consumer products in the realm of home ownership in the kitchen are, and how easy American wives had it compared to Russian women. Also, you have many American corporations becoming increasingly globalized. By 1950, the Coca-Cola company had 60 bottling plants on 6 continents, all but Antarctica. And this is an ad from around 1954. It gives you a sense of how Coke's trying to appeal to all these different sort of peoples around the world. That extra something made Coke the most asked for soft drink in the world, which was true. And then this gives you a sense of just how vast Coke's reach is getting. This is an ad for, celebrating Coca-Cola being in Iceland. This ad here is meant to sort of show you American values. Again, like Coca-Cola is evidence of American soft power, in which America is trying to seduce the rapidly decolonizing world with American products in the hopes of making them into trade partners, political partners, and even a Khrushchev at the 1959 meeting with Nixon drank Pepsi. Television, of course, becomes the central vehicle of advertising in the 1950s. Philip Farnsworth, of course, invents the TV in 1928, but it's not really mass produced or available to a mass consumer market until the end of World War II, early 1950s. So television became second only to cars, the most important appliance of affluence. In 1953, 2/3 of American households had television sets. By 1960, 94% had television sets. By the 1960s, Americans spent nearly as much time on average watching TV as working, which gives you a sense about the US becoming a fully integrated consumer market in which people think of their identities first and foremost in the context of themselves as a consumer rather than a factory worker, a lawyer, or whatever. So here's some ads for TV. This ad is telling you that TV is actually good for you, good for your kids. There was a bit of a fear during the 50s that television would rot your kids' brains, would sort of like turn them into automatons or like zombie-like people. But this ad is trying to, convince you that Motorola is actually a really good teacher for your kids. So this gives you a sense of the family all coming around and enjoying television during the evening. Presumably, you see the dad smoking his pipe, the kids enjoying. This looks like some sort of like tabloid, of course. And then what's the wife doing, of course? Go ahead.
She's kind of like serving the family, kind of just being a stereotypical housewife.
Yeah, exactly. So this isn't just selling you the Motorola TV, it's selling you this whole ethos of American family values in which the wife is sort of like, the servant at home, the husband's the breadwinner, who's wearing his slippers, smoking his pipes, the kids, just sort of having recreation time. And then, of course, as I've mentioned many times before, throughout the 20th century, Christmas gets to be more and more commodified, more of a consumer ritual. And of course, this TV is saying, buy your family Motorola television for Christmas. And they're watching Santa Claus on television. So during this time period, there's also a real product integration. These shows tend to be sponsored by corporations, and they'll be, say like Milton Berle in the Texaco Star Theater will, some point during the show, talk about how great Texaco is and how easy it is to get gas in your car, things like that. The I Love Lucy show was sponsored by Philip Morris, and of course, throughout the show, people are smoking Philip Morris and saying like, "Gee, this is really smooth, isn't it? I should love Philip Morris." Just sort of like integrating the product into it. Of course, like Chesterfield's in Dragnet. And again, as we'll see in a bit, tobacco advertisements are one of the preeminent advertisements during this time period. The Goodyear TV Playhouse. This was a children's show sponsored by Goodyear tires. The Howdy Doody show was sponsored by Welch's grape juice. The kids in the peanut gallery in the back here, you can see they would sing songs about how great Welch's juice was and how they, it's what they look forward to when they get out of school, things like that. So the big three, what we mean by the big three is NBC, CBS, and ABC. Remember, this is before the proliferation of cable television in the 70s and 80s. So just like the big three car companies have consolidated the market, these three TV stations have a real consolidation of the market too. And they basically control the airwaves, like everything you and your kids see. And TV advertising, as I said, becomes the preeminent force in the American consumer economy. So we've gone from the era of print advertising. Print advertising is still important. Billboard advertising is still important as it was in the early part of the 20th century, but by far the greatest advertisement vehicle is television. So Westerns are also very popular during this time period. They were the most popular genre in the 1950s. TV Westerns focused on kids and teens and came with a strong dose of social values. Values in parentheses or asterisks next to it, I guess. In 1959, Westerns accounted for 17.5 hours of primetime network broadcasting, which is just insane when you think about it. So Hopalong Cassidy was one of the most popular. You see sort of like products moving from the television screen out to things like, toys, mailboxes, or not mailboxes, lunchboxes, I should say, thermoses, etc. Which these are advertisements in and of themselves, So the Lone Ranger and Tonto became very popular. Gene Autry show was incredibly popular. Cisco Kid, Roy Rogers show. And again, you can see this Tyrone Power ad where he's popping cigarettes as well as his own brand, his show, etc. Levi's become very popular amongst kids in particular, teenagers. who are becoming the sort of preeminent consumers that marketers are gearing their ads to. But you get this sense of it selling that Western ethos, the sort of like frontier ethos that's still very popular in American culture. So I want to show you this toy gun ad, which I think is an interesting artifact of the era. You can see the print ad here of this kid sort of like happily like learning about his weapon. But I'll show you a TV ad that you would have seen during any number of these Westerns.
You've just seen a demonstration of the most authentic Western toy cap guns in the world. They're from Mattel. You can get any of Mattel's rifles or pistols separately or in sets. The Sundowner set, the Frontier set, the Buffalo Hunter set. All carry the rugged stamp of the Old West. You can tell they're Mattel. They're swell.
So what are some reasons why Westerns would be so popular during the Cold War in particular?
Because they mythologize the American past while also kind of reiterating those American values of independence and freedom and rugged individualism and the kind of frontiersman ethics.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's like a redux for the Cold War era, sort of like, reminding you of what like the best of American values are supposedly got.
I was gonna say, in my garage, I actually found one of the Mattel the Winchester replicas. I actually have one.
Wow.
Yeah, so from this exact time, because my uncle had it when he was a kid, he bought one of the sets. I don't know which one, but I still have the rifle.
Interesting.
Actually.
Yeah, you
So
might be able to sell it on eBay if that's the story.
yeah, they're about $100 right now.
Oh yeah. That's
Yeah.
not bad.
Mhm.
Considering they were probably like $1.25, like $3
Yeah.
when they came out. Yeah. So you can see right here it's $277. Okay. So yeah. Just speaking to Sam's point about like the ethos of Westerns, it was so popular and American channels are being proliferated around the world. So American Westerns are being broadcast throughout the world. The Soviet Union comes up with these things called Red Westerns or Osterns, Easterns. And they invert American Westerns, this notion of like the frontiersmen out on these sort of range, conquering Indians, opening up new territory for American affluence or beneficence, whatever the case may be. And the Indians in these Red Westerns, the Indians are sort of like victimized good guys in the contrast of cowboy imperialism. So they're very interesting. If you can find them, they're worth watching. But there's like a paradox of these too. Like this guy Mitrovich, who was like starred in many of these. He's like the John Wayne of these. He becomes like a huge star, and like why would that be contrary to sort of this like communist ethos to have like a star? Yeah, so it's like against communist values to have like a superstar, right? Like that's sort of like a capitalist American sort of like ethos where you have like Marilyn Monroe or John Wayne or whatever. So the notion that like this guy's starring in these films that are meant to critique capitalism becomes like a popular like national celebrity, like actually undermines the communist. It's sort of like a paradox. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that this sort of ideology of communism is that everyone's equal, nobody's above anyone else, nobody's below anyone else. But the very idea that there's this superstar who you should strive to be like, yeah, it's just completely antithetical to the idea that's being pushed by like, the whole committee and things that are pushing the propaganda.
Yeah, and it sort of reminds me of what we talked about with like the modernity of the female consumer of the 1920s, where like it's actually, as they're presenting this sort of like form of progress, it's actually like in reality like undermining the whole sort of like notion of progress. So I think you see this in Red Westerns as well. So again, as I said, like American television is exported to the rest of the world. By 1958, US networks sold $15 million worth of American programming to other nations. By the early 1960s, ABC alone owned a stake in 54 different stations in 24 different nations. So again, this is American soft power being exported out to the world along with Coca-Cola and other American products. You get a sense of the Yowdy Doody show, which was very popular in pre-revolutionary Cuba. It's basically Howdy Doody, but with like, Spanish dolls and actors, maybe a tweak in the motif. Ronald Reagan, of course, people, when he was elected in the 1980s, people said he was like the first television president. So I just want to show you a little thing with him in the 1950s, in which he becomes sort of like a national figure. He moves from like B-list movies to like A-list television.
That was Act One of The Fenton Touch, starring Jack Benny. Now for special news about General Electric's new 1958 filter flow washer. This is the wonderful filter flow washing system introduced and perfected by General Electric to give clean, bright washes with no lint fuzz. Lint is caught for good here in this easy to reach, easy to clean, non-clogging filter. No more linty socks like these. Instead, clean and bright with no lint fuzz. And with this new 1958 General Electric, you get filter flow washing plus wash to order fabric keys. You simply touch one key to give your wash load the just right combination of wash and spin speeds and water temperatures. There's a clearly marked key for all your washables, cottons, synthetics, and specials. Results? Everything clean and sparkling with no lint fuzz. See this big capacity 1958 General Electric filter flow washer and matching dryer at your General Electric dealers.
Yeah, so again, all of these labor-saving devices created by GE, which is the fourth largest corporation in the country at the time, they're meant to make the life of the housewife easier. But also Reagan, he's sort of associated with GE, which is a really well-respected company. He's sort of like in your home every day. You grow up with him a lot of times. So by the time the 1980s roll around, he's like sort of like a member of the family. It's just sort of inevitable that you would vote for him. Like people couldn't understand why, people who had voted for Carter or, any other Democrat from the 1960s, LBJ or whatever, was so into Reagan. It's because, they had a relationship with Reagan by the time he ran for president. And underscoring the importance of television in the realm of politics, when Nixon and Kennedy debated in 1960, ahead of the 1960 November election, Nixon was just the vice president of Eisenhower, which was a really successful campaign, a really successful administration, I should say. Everyone thought Nixon was going to defeat Kennedy, who was, inexperienced, sort of like considered a political dilettante. Until they had a television debate, and Kennedy looked so cool, calm, and collected. He was like TV ready, and Nixon was like sort of like sweating and babbling, and just sort of like, people saw the two side by side, and it really turned people onto Kennedy and turned people off to Nixon. And it made the difference really in a very close election. And of course, as American TV is spreading around the world, American advertising agencies like J. Walter Thompson are setting up offices in places like Madrid, Paris, Tokyo, all around the world, selling American products as other countries develop their own TV stations or their own public communication systems. J. Walter Thompson is there to sort of sell brands to these television markets. And this will hopefully excite you. Automania of the 1950s becomes sort of ubiquitous. The car becomes really central to American life. Other than owning a home, whatever car you have really sort of like expressed to other Americans like who or what you were. So in 1955, the US produced 2/3 of the world's supply of autos. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler accounted for 94% of the American automobile output. You can see sort of like the space age, how it's influencing the design of cars. Of course, through the 50s and 60s, you get the rise of NASA, and car companies are trying to cash in on the craze surrounding the space age. So I'll show you a quick video that focuses on the two.
By the 1950s, it was not unusual for families to have more than one car. The concept of the husband going off to work in the morning and the wife staying home dutifully with the kids was really beginning to change. People began thinking that the car isn't just utilitarian transportation. It should be fun. It's an escape. What was the most modern thing? Well, jet aircraft, certainly, rocketry. People like Harley Earl at General Motors were looking at these trends and saying, okay, the car of tomorrow is going to be like an airplane for the road. The Firebird is a perfect example. And here's an automobile that looks for all the world like a jet plane without wings. In fact, it has these little vestigial wings so that it wouldn't take off. It was an idea car. You know, it was a laboratory of wheels. The Motoramas, which came to cities all around the country, showed you the car of tomorrow and offered you the car of today. The dream cars, like our Buick Centurion, said, okay, here's the Buick of tomorrow. And by the way, we'd love to sell you today's Buick. These dream cars were a great way to get people in, get them excited. And I think to some degree, people were feeling, I've got some of that dream car in the car that I have. And many times the features of these dream cars found their way into production cars. Harley Earl and Alfred Sloan ran General Motors. Harley Earl was his prophet of style. They developed the concept of planned obsolescence. It was easy enough to say, okay, we have to cut new tooling anyway, let's change the fenders. The cars were different each year, which meant that keeping up with the Joneses, looking next door and saying, oh, they've got the new 57 Chevy, it makes our 55 look sort of dowdy. Maybe we should get the new 58, which look totally different. In the 50s, the notion was you traded your car every 2 to 3 years. You wanted the latest.
All right, so you can see with this ad in particular, you can see the jet in the background and the car company, in this case Chrysler, trying to sort of capitalize on this, you know, ethos of you have this sort of like jet pilot, which would break the sound barrier, trying to evoke that the car is as fast as the jet, or sleek, or, you know, futuristic. I mean, you can see just for the 1908 Model T, just how drastically cars have changed in a 50-year span or so. So during the 50s, auto production increased to 8 million units annually, and by 1960, there were more than 70 million cars on the roads. In 1955, GM became the first US company to make more than $1 billion in a single year. By 1960, it had become the world's largest corporation, surpassing in income the gross national product of many nations. And part of the reason that cars are becoming so ubiquitous and popular is because it's just much easier to make them. During World War II, there's all kinds of refinements to the assembly line, to car production, things like that. And so here's the Ford factory. They could just churn out cars at like a record clip. You heard on the video, hopefully, that he mentioned Alfred Sloan, who's the head of GM. There's this term that's created in the 50s called Sloanism. Sloan's philosophy was to use extensive marketing and constant design changes to convince Americans to buy new cars regardless of need, and this was what became known as planned obsolescence. Sloan created a ladder of consumption with different brands of cars tailored to different income levels. Sloanism was so successful that the family car became the most important marker of American success among all classes during the 1950s. So again, planned obsolescence, the notion that even if something works just fine, you're trying to keep up with the Joneses. And if the Joneses get the latest car, like, you know, you don't want to think that you're lesser than the Joneses who live next door. So you get an even nicer car. It's like this whole arms race to see who's the best, the most affluent consumer. Of course, you see this today in Air Jordans, all kinds of different things, Apple products. There's also something called flexible accumulation that comes out of this era, where you build, say, a product like a car in, say, like 12 different locations, right? So like the tire will be built, say, like in Akron, the windows will be built in Toledo, the rest of the car will be built in Detroit or somewhere else. So why would this be an important thing for like business owners, this sort of flexible accumulation? So like for the Nike variation, they'll have like the soles of the shoes built in Malaysia, another part of the shoe built in Saigon, another part of the shoe built in, say, like Taipei or something like that. So why would that be advantageous for the business owner, Nike in this case? Anyone? Go ahead.
Well, I was thinking like maybe where the
like the product that they're using is like less expensive in the different.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. To source it would be cheaper. But the biggest reason is that if, say, like the people in Saigon go on strike, you can easily shut down that operation and move to somewhere else so the manufacturer keeps going. So you're basically this effort to flexible accumulation is to diminish the workers' ability to sort of like shut down your operation. But that was pioneered in the car industry in the 1950s America. So what class of consumer, according to Sloanism, would buy this car, Cadillac? Upper class, middle class, lower class, do you think? Go ahead.
Upper class for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Upper class. Cadillac, all through the 20th century, was like the preeminent symbol of having made it in American society. So you can even see the way the Cadillac's marketing itself with the sort of like this like monarchical like pendant or whatever, and like their logo sort of like looks like a coat of arms. Here's another Cadillac one. So this is selling the Cadillac, obviously, but what else is it selling? Go ahead.
Like it's made for families.
Yeah, exactly. So it's selling that sort of like notion of like the upper middle class, like nuclear family, the kids in their nice sort of like short pantsuits, baby on the mom's lap, she's probably wearing Dior or something like that. And of course, the happy big sister in the background. So yeah, it's selling that sort of nuclear family ethos. So what class do you think Dodge would be catered to? Go ahead.
I feel like that would be catered to like middle class.
Yeah, probably like up and coming people. So like a young couple just starting out, maybe, rather than that sort of wholly formed nuclear family the last Cadillac had. What about this one? What do you think? Ford. Go ahead.
That's like kind of a I feel like that would be like a mainstream like family car. Like I wouldn't say that that's for like the upper class or the lower class, but I feel like that would be like a good mainstream like family car, like for living in the suburbs and like.
Yeah, good. So I mean, who would Ford be marketed to primarily today? What kind of market? Go ahead.
Well, just real quick to go back to this, I almost maybe feel like people with less income who aren't necessarily for maybe like a teenager, maybe like your first car, kind of. That's what they're trying to get off.
Yeah, maybe so. But I think like Ford, all through its history, has sort of tried to find like the middle of the road type of consumer, like the largest audience, so to speak. So like, working class to like middle class, but not necessarily upper class, like Cadillac buyers. All right, so what about this one?
Middle class or middle class.
Yeah, probably like working class. You just get the sense of like he's on a farm, there's chickens running around, he's loading things into it. So yeah, I would say like working class, like but you get the segment between like urban market and rural market during this time period as well. And then which would this try to appeal to? What do you think? Go ahead, Sam.
I think upper middle class, like you said, like kind of up and coming people who are advancing on the social ladder.
Yeah, I agree. So what's sort of like, what do you see?
Well, they have like the
in
new
house?
modern outline house, and they
Yeah.
have 2 cars in the driveway and a garage.
Yeah, exactly. So you have that sort of like split level, like Frank Lloyd Wright, like in like, model of house. What kind of car would this be? Like a sedan or a sports car?
That looks like a coupe, I think.
This here, yeah, I think it's like a sports car. So that would probably be like the husband's, and then this would probably be like the wife's car. So again, you get this ethos of having made it, meaning like 2 cars as well. So again, you see these like championing of tail fins, which are associated with planned obsolescence. But who's the consumer in all of these? Like what gender, what class? Go ahead. Yeah, woman. So probably like upper middle class woman dressed in like a sort of like neat, nice Dior type of cut dress. And again, there's this ethos all through the 1950s that just having 1 car isn't good enough. Having 2 cars, like one for the husband, one for the family, usually like a station wagon, as you see in this ad, to sort of like tote groceries, tote kids, tote the dog, whatever the case may be. And of course, VW. You remember last week I showed you their ad campaign, how they were trying to market themselves as being the antithesis of this whole like big car planned obsolescence theme. So what's Volkswagen selling you in this ad, other than the Volkswagen?
That you really put it in a new car because it's like it's durable, it's not, it's everlasting.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like the antithesis of planned obsolescence. It's like you buy a Volkswagen and you keep it for a long while because it's a great car. Yeah, so good. Again, Volkswagen's trying to market itself in this new market in which big cars are all the rage as the antidote to this sort of like crass consumerism. And again, a lot of this is being fueled by the creation of the national highway system, which begins in 1956 and goes throughout the 20th century, basically connecting all of these divergent markets into like one holistic like nation state through its highway system. And of course, things like McDonald's become very popular in the 1950s. They have drive-throughs catering to the driver slash, hamburger buyer, whatever the case may be. You can get a sense of, McDonald's branding with the golden arches, which is one of the most iconic brands, of course, in consumer culture. You can see the price of what everything would have cost then compared to now. Here's another great McDonald's ads where you get the sense of these sort of like 1950s cars that were, would be attracted to a place like this. You get drive-in theaters. I'm not even sure if there's, I think there might be a few drive-in theaters left, but they were very popular in the 1950s. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, there's a car show that happens, like it kind of at the end of every summer called Lead East, where I've gone for the past, I don't know, 5 years or something like that, where it's all just super old cars, and they actually have a drive-in theater like that they set up just for this show. And it's like
where's that?
It's up in I forget exactly what. Oh, Parsippany. It's at the Hilton in Parsippany. And it's like it's the 1 year they had so many cars that like it overfilled every single parking lot they had available.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah. So
Well,
it's
people just show up with like cars from this era and whatnot.
everything.
Oh wow.
All old cars. The oldest car I think was they had a Model T, and then they had everything on up. They had a Model T and then everything else after. They had just everything you could possibly want to see.
Interesting.
Everything.
Have you ever seen the movie? Have you ever heard the movie The Founder? It's about
Yeah.
About
the
like
guy who
he-
did McDonald's.
yeah. I was
Michael
just
Keaton
wondering if
stars
you
in it.
ever. Yeah, I was gonna mention that. or,
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, it's
and then-
pretty good. I mean, what's interesting about McDonald's is they're like a real estate operation first and foremost. They buy up like all kinds of real estate. The price always goes up. So even if the restaurant doesn't make money, they're still making money off of like owning the real estate.
Cool. Ever seen Super Size Me? The first two movies.
Oh God, not Super Size
Oh yeah. With
Yes.
Morgan Spurlock.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so he's
Dr.
done
Neff-
for McDonald's 3 days straight. Then the second one is opening his own healthy chicken restaurant.
Yeah, but I mean, that's an interesting point because like whenever I think of the golden arches during this time period, and it's like rise, it's like, be careful what you wish for,
Yeah.
because like it seems like such a great like consumer product at the time, but of course it's created like all kinds of like
Issues.
problems in American life. Yeah. All right, so of course mobile leisure becomes very popular too as a result in part of the proliferation of cars being manufactured, the highway system. And there's this whole ethos to like see the USA in your Chevrolet. So like to be an American means to sort of like visit all of the national parks, to visit cities you haven't been to create a more nuanced sense of what it means to be an American citizen during this very patriotic moment in American history. Go ahead.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. America's asking you to call. That was the commercial.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Dinah Shore sings it. I was going to play it for you, but it's it's a big.
I'm
cringe,
sorry.
so-
I ruined everything. I'm sorry. I know way too much about cars. I'm sorry I had to ruin it.
You basically summed it up for us, so okay, I appreciate it. But yeah, Dinah Shore sings this very sort of like cringy, like "See the USA in your Chevrolet." Does this whole dance? It's like a song. So all right, and again, there's a tourism boom. There's all of these roadside inns that pop up all along America. It's now like roadside inns are ubiquitous. Every exit that you pass, you see dozens of them. That didn't used to exist before the 1950s, and again, it's part of this like huge change from like a consumer culture, a producer culture to a consumer culture, and these roadside inns are like artifacts of this whole thing. And of course, the national parks become very popular. You might recall that all through the New Deal, the CCC is really establishing the national parks as tourist destinations. But a lot of the national parks, especially the ones south of the Mason-Dixon lines, are like white-only parks, which sort of complicates the notion of who gets to see the USA in their Chevrolet, who actually gets like a full stake in American identity, American consumer identity, etc. Of course, during this time period, air travel has become much safer as a result of innovations, refinements that happened during World War II. Fuel is much cheaper. Eisenhower during the 50s creates all kinds of relationships with oil producing nations such as Saudi Arabia in particular. So gas becomes much cheaper. So air travel becomes much cheaper. And you can see a TWA in this ad here where they're basically telling you like all of the destination routes in the US you can go to throughout Europe, Saudi Arabia, Northern Africa, etc. So again, like if you're a certain class, it's not just about seeing the USA, it's about traveling as far and wide as you can and becoming a sophisticated consumer. Here's an ad for Chicago, Braniff Airways. So again, this would be like the see the USA in your Braniff airline, whatever. And then here's an ad to go to Paris. A lot of American troops had gone through Paris, so there was a whole craze of like taking your wife over to see Paris because she missed out on all the fun when you were there. Mallorca becomes a popular destination. Spain's still a fascist nation from the 1930s all the way through 1975, but the U.S. makes a deal with Franco to build a U.S. Air Force base there, which turns Spain into a huge tourist destination for Americans, upper class Americans anyway. And of course, all of this is being fueled by oil. The U.S. becomes like fully integrated into oil culture. You can see this beach in Huntington, just outside of Los Angeles. All these oil derricks in the back. So it's sort of strange that you would go to a beach to have like an oil spill, but you know, what have you. So let's just look around the room. What all is made of plastic in this room? Just point something out if you see it. Go ahead.
Trash can.
Trash can. What else? Your computers, right? This thing up here, these here, all of these. Like so, basically everything's made of plastic, and plastic is derivative of oil. So we tend to think of oil as you know, fueling your cars or jets or whatever, but really plastic is in just about everything. So in 1967, of the 10 largest corporations were either auto producers or oil producers. And more products through the 1950s were made of plastics, which are of course derived from oil. And of course, it's even more ubiquitous today. Cigarette companies, as I mentioned earlier, are some of the most prominent advertisers during this time period. But you can see they're capturing this outdoor craze, this see America type craze, go camping type craze in cigarette ads. But also this like rugged individualism of Westerns that's so popular too. So this guy's like, you know, going out fishing, relaxing with his camel. This guy's like got his shotgun, presumably out hunting, or just sort of engaged in vigilante activity, I'm not sure. But he's clearly enjoying his tent. Skiing becomes very popular along with tourism in the 1950s. So here's two people sort of like taking a cigarette break on the slopes. John Wayne, of course, the quintessential like, you know, emblem of American consumer masculinity, Westerns. Here he is enjoying his camel. Ronald Reagan's in a number of cigarette commercials. This one's for Chesterfield for give out cigarettes for Christmas, I guess is what he's trying to convey. There's another with Reagan. There's also all these ads, but by the 1950s, everyone knows that cigarettes are giving you cancer. The Surgeon General doesn't come out with their report until 1964, but everyone knows that like cigarettes are like making your teeth fall out, they're giving you cancer, etc. So oddly enough, they have these like babies that are integrated into cigarette commercials or ads, print ads. And it says, before you scold me, Mom, maybe you better light up a Marlboro. So what's that sort of like indicating? Go ahead.
Kind of like need to relax.
Yeah, exactly. That like mom's mad at baby, but like if she just has a cigarette, she'll chill out. And then of course on the right, or my right, and your right too, it's sort of like the baby saying that the dad has the best of everything. This whole like consumer ethos of like you have to have the best of everything. And of course, Marlboro is being presented as the best. And this one too, it's like during the this era in history, like if you fought in World War II, you were considered like a national hero. People would say thank you for your service. You would get this pin, and you have this little kid like asking what the pin is about. He's basically saying I'm a war hero, even though I'm like blowing the cigarette smoke in your face, Sonny. So it's sort of like a strange ethos. I think cigarette companies trying to convince smokers that it's okay to smoke cigarettes around their kids. They don't have to be concerned about it. And of course, here's the famous doctor convincing you that one cigarette brand is better than the other. I'll play this commercial really quick. Again, this goes out of fashion after the 1964 Surgeon General warning, but in the 1950s, it's being propagated in television as well as print ads.
You know, if you were to follow a busy doctor as he makes his daily round of calls, you would find yourself having a mighty busy time keeping up with him. Time out for many men of medicine usually means just long enough to enjoy a cigarette. And because they know what a pleasure it is to smoke a mild, good-tasting cigarette, they're particular about the brand they choose. In a repeated national survey, doctors in all branches of medicine, doctors in all parts of the country were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?" Once again, the brand named most was Camel. Yes, according to this repeated nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Why not change to Camels for the next 30 days and see what a difference it makes in your smoking enjoyment? See how Camels agree with your throat. See how mild and good tasting a cigarette can be.
So during this time period, there's a great deal of fear that America is becoming too conformist, especially in the realm of consumers. And so, does anyone recognize this guy here? It's Leonardo DiCaprio. It's from a movie called Revolutionary Road. The movie is sort of like critiquing the conformity and like soullessness of corporate consumer America. It's a good movie, but it's very depressing. So T.S. Eliot, who tends to be sort of like have a bit of a fascist bent to him. Aldous Huxley tends to be a leftist. William F. Buckley, who's the voice of like American conservatism, the conscience of American conservatism during this time period. One thing they all agree on is that this sort of like conformity of American culture is soul stealing and ultimately bad for the nation. Mad Magazine, of course, becomes popular in the 1950s among teenagers. It also lampoons this conformity of American culture. One of the main things that sort of like underscores the increased anxiety around the American consumer culture is the fact that like you could buy these bomb shelters, which they would have models trying to convince you that like one bomb shelter was better than the other, which underscores the notion that like this whole party could be over at any moment, but they're sort of like capitalizing on it, which just seems like crass and shallow and gross in some way. Of course, there's all of these rituals that sort of like keep people panicked and afraid during this time period, the duck and cover drills. So like you would be sitting, in second period or whatever, coloring, and a siren would go off and everyone would have to duck and cover as if like this would save you from an atomic blast. There's a great deal of depression. Rates of depression spike amongst housewives in particular. This whole notion that like being a housewife and having all of these products available to you or being the like primary consumer in your household was like an ill for all that ailed you. Just sort of like it's really challenged in the 1950s. You can see the Schlitz ad where like the wife is crying. It says, "Don't worry, darling, you didn't burn the beer." But yeah, I mean, this whole notion that like a woman's like sense of self and meaning was like rooted in her family or like cleaning products or cooking things rather than actually sort of like writing books or like making films or whatever like you might find meaningful nowadays. Old-time religion, there's a real resurgence of religion during the 1950s, partly driven by this fear of, you can die any second, so you want to know that you're going to heaven afterwards. Billy Graham becomes hugely popular during this time period. He gives sermons in Los Angeles in this Kansas cathedral to start out with. He builds a huge following, and then starts to have like sermons on television and starts giving sermons all around the country in stadiums, often of which are televised. Francis Spellman becomes very popular, a voice of moral authority, as does Bishop Fulton Sheen, both Catholics. Norman Vincent Peale writes a really popular book called How to Influence People and Win Arguments. It's really popular with like Fred Trump, who made Donald Reagan, sort of like Donald Trump's like sort of philosophy of business is rooted in this guy's book. Now, again, as I said, religion is really resurgent in the 1950s. In 1950 alone, membership in Protestant denominations increased by 4% in just 1 year, which is astonishing. While the number of American Roman Catholics grew by 2%, which is also pretty astonishing. This trend accelerated throughout the decade as church membership increased from 58% of the population in 1950 to 63 in 1959. Evangelicals gained more millions of converts during the 1950s, especially in the transient Southwest. By 1959, Americans invested $935 million annually in new church construction, much of it in Los Angeles and other developing regions or Western cities. You have the U.S. increasingly this conflation between church and state. There had always been a conscientious, separation of church and state up to the 1950s, but as communism is taking root around the world, there's this notion that communists are godless. They have this notion that religion is the opiate of the masses. So this is when "In God We Trust" gets put on the dollar bill. And also the dollar becomes the preeminent form of currency in the world, surpassing the British pound. So this whole notion of the U.S. being associated with God is sort of like spread all throughout the world. It's also important to note that Christians become increasingly integrated into the American political system. Protestants had normally rejected politics. They might go and vote on election day, but they didn't talk about their politics. They didn't go to rallies. They didn't hold up like stop abortion signs, things like that. Their politics was always a private matter, but during this time period, you can get a real conflation with politics and religion, which forms what we think of as Christian nationalism now. So there's also a corporate order and an industrial labor, which sort of like comes to the fore of American society. GE in particular, through the expansion and consolidation, became America's fourth largest company in the 1950s with 136 factories in 28 states. It was the nation's third largest employer. So again, GE built just about everything. So from light bulbs to televisions to jet engines to just about everything you can think of. They were fully integrated, especially in this part of the country. We have organizational men come to the fore out of these large corporations. In 1957, white-collar workers outnumbered blue-collar workers for the first time in American history. And for critics, these corporate strivers represented the apex of a conformist society. Organizational men in the 1950s dressed in uniform suits, commuted on crowded trains or highways, and worked long hours on mind-numbing bureaucratic tasks. And to climb the company ladder, corporate ladder, they were expected to move often and to conform without question to rigid corporate rules of behavior. But during this time period, a lot of sociologists, academics start to really criticize this corporate order, this organizational structure. David Reisman's one of them. So you can see in this Time Life cover how these guys are wearing these sort of corporatized suits, and there's all of these masses of corporate types down here, and they have like a wind-up thing on the back of them to indicate that they're like automatons. They're losing their individualism, their spirituality, which Reisman in particular thinks is a bad thing. He publishes a book in 1950 called The Lonely Crowd. He found widespread unhappiness amongst men who comprised American corporate culture. Reisman worried that Americans had lost what German sociologist Max Weber referred to as the Protestant work ethic, which is the moral drive to prosper through one's own individual hard work, which he felt had accounted for the greatness of America. Another critic of this corporate industrial order is William White Jr. He publishes this book in 1956 called Organizational Man, which becomes a bestseller. He argues that there was a great deal of anxiety among white-collar workers who were disengaged from their families and traditional social structures by rigid corporate work lives and long commutes. White's book buttressed concerns on the part of religious leaders that increased affluence did not necessarily translate into universal happiness and social well-being. So here's Sloan Wilson. He wrote this book in 1955. It came out called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. It's a novel, which was also a bestseller. He painted a disturbing dystopian picture of a mind-numbing and soul-stealing conformity in corporate America. Wilson's novel helped popularize concerns surrounding American ennui and loss of spiritual meaning in the realm of a corporatist consumer society. And from all of this, you have these people's kids becoming sort of more rebellious, more sort of like anti-authority. So during the 1950s, teenagers emerged as a distinct consumer group. In 1930, only 50% of America's 14 to 27-year-olds attended high school. But by 1950, this number had climbed to 73%. By the 1950s, teens driving sales of records and fashion were the most sought after market segment. And by the 1960s, with an average income of $10 per week, teens contributed more than $10 billion to the US economy per year. And all of these magazines, different sort of media, specifically geared towards selling kids products or selling kids consumer culture, rock and roll, etc., become popular. 17 magazine. Chuck Berry becomes a huge national figure. Fats Domino, Little Richard, Elvis Presley becomes a huge national star. Jerry Lee Lewis as well. And there's this whole pop fanaticism in which rock and roll is driving consumer culture and consumer culture is driving rock and roll. All kinds of movies come out during the 50s that sort of like champion disaffected youth or like anti-authoritarian youths, like Marlon Brando's The Wild One, James Dean's Rebel Without a Cause, Blackboard Jungle starring Glenn Ford, West Side Story came out in 1957. Spielberg, of course, just had a redux of it, but it's very popular. So like, you know, image of disaffected youths. Marlon Brando becomes a huge national figure. James Dean as well. Sidney Poitier becomes a national figure as well. J.D. Salinger writes a book called Catcher in the Rye, which not champions, but sort of exposes America to the notion of like these restless youths. Jack Kerouac becomes the sort of spokesperson for the Beat Generation. He writes this popular book called On the Road, which is published in 1957, where he basically travels around the country searching for meaning wherever he can find it. Williams S. Burroughs writes this book called Naked Lunch, which becomes a bestseller, in which his main characters, and it's a series of vignettes, but they all challenge the authority of the era. So Allen Ginsberg, he writes this poem called Howl. I'll just play you like 2 minutes of it. I think it does a really good job of summing up the disaffection with this conformity in consumer culture.
Moloch, whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows. Moloch, whose skyscrapers stand in the long streets like endless Jehovah's. Moloch, whose factories dream and croak in the fog. Moloch, whose love is endless oil and stone. Moloch, whose soul is electricity and banks. Moloch, whose fate is a cloud of sexless hydrogen. Moloch, in whom I sit lonely. Moloch, in whom I dream angels. Crazy in Moloch, cocksucker in Moloch, black love and manless in Moloch. Moloch, who entered my soul early. Moloch, who frightened me out of my natural ecstasy. Moloch, whom I abandoned. Wake up in Moloch, light streaming out of the sky. Moloch, Moloch, robot apartments, invisible suburbs, skeleton treasuries, blind capitals, demonic industries, spectral nations, invincible madhouses, granite cocks, monstrous bombs. They broke their backs lifting Moloch to heaven. Pavements, trees, lifting the city to heaven, which exists and is everywhere about us. Dreams, adorations, illuminations, religions, the whole boatload of sensitive bullshit. Breakthroughs, over the river, flips and crucifixions gone down the flood, highs, epiphanies, despairs, 10 years, animal screams and suicides, mimes, new loves, mad generation, down the rocks of time, real holy laughter in the river. They saw it all. the wild eyes, the holy yells. They bade farewell. They jumped off the roof to solitude, waving, carrying flowers down to the river, into the street.
Yes, that's is it James or John Franco? Can't remember. Playing Allen Ginsberg in a movie called Hal. But I think the poem does a good job of summing up that sort of like disaffectedness, like the fear and anxiety associated with this affluent society, as it's called. So Hal in particular spoke to a growing number of alienated dissenters in a society obsessed with materialism and anti-communism. This guy, Robert Frank, sort of provided the pictures to this ethos, this beat ethos. He traveled across the country just sort of like taking snapshots of things that he thought like sort of summed up America in the 1950s in this book called The Americans. So I'll just show you some of the pictures that he took. So this was on Wall Street, just sort of like haunted view of America. This one of sort of like a public bathroom where someone's getting a shoe shine. You get this sort of like black mammy ethos still popular in the 50s of like a black woman raising a well-to-do white kid. This I think is a good one of the Western era in particular, kids buying fake toy guns, etc. This picture I find like very sort of like haunting of this girl at a picnic smoking a cigarette. So just to sum up the Beat generation, Beat celebrated nonconformity and experimentation in their lives, compared in contrast to the conformity of the sort of mainstream American society. So you get this real flowering of the counterculture that becomes so prominent in American culture and consumer culture in the 1960s. It starts to take root amongst the Beat generations in the 50s. Beat literature, 1950s films, and rock and roll all revealed the diversity of American culture brewing beneath the conformity of the decade. And by calling into question America's traditional values, 1950s nonconformists had taken the first steps towards a critical collaboration between alienated progressive whites and Black civil rights activists. All right, so just looking ahead toward Thursday, we'll focus entirely on women in the 1950s, particularly in the realm of how they're depicted in advertisements, but also women in the advertising industry. So be sure to read Savolka's The Fabulous 50s, which is, of course, posted to Moodle. We'll discuss that as well as some other things. All right, so I'll see you guys on Thursday. Have a good rest of your week.
Yeah.
I neglected to bring this up when we were talking about cars, but Jillian and I, we went out this weekend and we went to this car dealership and somebody drove by in a Ford Model A.
Oh, really?
Yep, somebody drove by in a Ford Model A. Just, that
I
was so
don't
cool.
see many
No,
of those.
Yeah, they're like
anymore.
almost priceless nowadays.
Yeah.
And there's also that like old, like that first like Mercedes model too.
Oh yeah, that one too. Yeah, there's a dealership on Route 22, the Ray Katina Mercedes dealer. They have a replica of the Benz patent motor wagon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so
When did that come out?
1890s.
Wow.
Yep, they have a replica of it. It's a 2002. It's a like Mercedes sanctioned replica
Awesome.
that they made. So
sick.
yeah.
Awesome, yeah.
Gee, I wonder if you can tell what my primary source paper is going to be.
Hopefully.
Thank you.
What else would it be?
See you guys.
Bye. Have a good day.
Take care, you too.
You as well.